Okay.
Sure.
All right. We should be unmuted now. Okay. So all right. Sound problems resolved. So we already know that Angular is great for single page applications, but it hasn't been great for much beyond that for a while. And so like if you work for a company that has a bunch of teams working on different projects, like there are different ways, like problems you might encounter with sharing code. So obviously like libraries are one way that we handle this, but like, so in our work life, our marketing department has a static website, and sometimes they're like, can we use this picker? And we're like, no, you can't, because it's not something that we can just pass over to you. And so, or like some companies I know are able to use different frameworks on different teams. So maybe you have some teams that use Vue, some that use React, and some that use Angular, and you need a way to share code and like save work in between all of those. So Angular Elements gives us a way to do that by using web components. And so web components, they allow you to write like a fully encapsulated custom element that you can use anywhere. So it's very like plug and play. All of the logic is encompassed within it. And it's a standalone self-contained tab, just like div or main or span or whatever. And it's based on a set of 4 standards. So it's based on HTML templates, the shadow DOM, HTML imports, and custom elements. And so what we're really going to talk about is custom elements. So custom elements give you a standard way to define a web component and to create those new DOM elements that work just like the ones you know. It comes out of the box in Chrome, Safari, and Opera, and then there are really easy polyfills for Edge and Firefox, and God only knows for IE. I really don't. But so essentially, the goal, right, is to do what we already do with Angular components everywhere. So we want to be able to define the component and then just use the selector in a template and kind of just have everything work. Like there shouldn't have to be a lot of spin up. It should just be define a component, use your selector, and then anywhere in a template, put it in. And so you can just write web components as is with vanilla JavaScript. It's pretty low level. It's like there's a full DOM API that you would have to like write and wrap yourself. And you can use Polymer, which I actually think is really cool. But I still think it's not a tool that I use day to day, and it's not a tool that my team uses. And so when I look at the pro of Angular Elements, it's that you can tell someone, hey, with the tool set you already have, there's this whole new realm available to you. And so that's really what Angular Elements gives us. Polymer is, I'm not sure if it's a library or framework, but it's another way to build web components. It's a project from Google. And so enter Angular Elements. So Angular Elements are just Angular components. You write them exactly the same as you typically would write an Angular component. And then you package it as a custom element that meets those web standards we were talking about for web components. And so when you package your Angular component as an Angular element, it will function anywhere in a framework agnostic way. So essentially it's Angular on the inside, web component on the outside. Just like a mullet, party in the back, business in the front. But the reverse of that, you know what I mean? And so Angular elements are self-bootstrapping. So like if you've written an Angular app before, then you're used to having to call Bootstrap on it. But they handle all of that themselves. And so essentially the Angular element like hosts the component and essentially a full Angular application to an extent inside that custom element. It's a bridge between the DOM APIs that are already existing and then the Angular components. So all of the like your Angular inputs are now properties that you can access in the DOM. Your host bindings are now attributes. You can bind to outputs. They're just like DOM events. And so to use an Angular element, you basically just generate a bundle of your code that you include in an HTML page. And then once that's there, you can reference by the selector anywhere. Totally self-contained. You can be consumed like straight out of the box, literally anywhere. And so how to do this? So basically, to an existing CLI application, you'd run ng-add at Angular Elements. And so that'll do some setup for you. That'll give you the I think it's a document registry polyfill, so that'll set that up. It'll add in some dependencies that you need to use to package your components as Angular elements. And then you basically just build your components as usual. So if you're using the Angular CLI, you could generate a component and you'd want to set the view encapsulation to native immediately. So that's really the one thing that you have to make sure that you do, like kind of at the outset. And then you just write a component like normal. So here's a component. We have a component decorator. We're going to define the selector as ngBasic. We have a super basic template. We have like an input, one input, and one output. So we're going to emit an event on the click, and then we're going to pass in a title. And so that's pretty much it. So it's basically like all the things you normally will do for a component, you can go ahead and do. And then you'll create your module. And so for this, the only special thing you need to do is you need to import the create custom element from Angular Elements. And then you need to, so in this case, the basic component is the one that we're creating as a web component. So we're declaring it here. And then we also have to specify that it's an entry component. And so that lets the browser know that that's going to be like an access point. And so from there, inside the constructor, you use that create custom element that you imported from Angular Elements to do some magic and to actually package your custom element. And so here we're using custom elements to define ngBasic, the selector tag that we want, with the basic component that we defined. And then you just build that consumable file. And so in your package JSON, so for the build one, you want to build it to prod. And then in this case, I did no hashing. And then I also wanted to, so the only thing I don't like is that it outputs 4 JS files. And so here we're just going to cat it into a single JS file. So we'd run build and then we'd run package. And at the end, we have a single JavaScript file called ngElements.js. And then you can just consume it. And so we're including the script tag, and then we can use the ngBasic tag in any standalone HTML file. So it's really that simple. One file, and then your selector is totally accessible.
You bundle web in the same thing, or is it one?
It's a good question. I think you can bundle several into the same thing as long as you declare them in that entry components. Okay, so code time. So we'll walk through kind of what we already looked at. So this is an Angular CLI application that I generated. It has one component, which is the basic component. And so essentially we just have some text. Hi, I'm an Angular element. We have a button that has a click output, and it fires on click. We have a little bit of styling, and then down here, so we're initializing this input to a title of click me, and then we have an action that's an event emitter. And so every time that fires, we'll fire that inside the on click, and so we'll just emit a click counter, how many times you've clicked. We have a couple potential titles that we're going to alternate through. And so that's kind of just to show that the DOM is updating and that we can, that the change detection is firing. So there's a couple different titles there, and then we initialized a counter to 0. And so on click, then we're going to increment the counter, we're going to change the title, and we'll emit that action. And then the only thing special about change title is that you do need to trigger it you need to tell it to detect changes when there are changes to the element. So that's the one thing that I've noticed some granularity with that you need to be careful about. Like without detect changes, the title of this would stay static. And so let's go ahead and I'll show you what this is. So this is just localhost, typical ng serve, right? So this is basic Angular dev server. So we have, I'm an Angular element, click me, title changes, everything works as expected. And so within Angular, it's all the same as we thought it would be. So then the app module is, as I had described earlier, so we have that create custom element from Angular Elements. up here. So we're importing that guy. We're specifying our basic component and our entry components. And then inside the constructor, we are creating the custom element and defining it. And then we're calling ngDo bootstrap, which is another part that you have to do. And yeah.
Okay, on the basic component TS, you're injecting HTTP client.
Yeah.
Is that necessary for elements, or is that just something you're going to be doing?
I was making calls to an API. That was all. Okay. Yeah. So that's not essential.
Okay, and then on the module.
Yep.
On line 17, you're using custom elements.
Yes.
I don't see where that's important. I see create custom
elements. It's basically, it comes part and parcel with create custom element. So like it's not defined, and it's weird, but like in Angular's documentation, this is how it tells you to do it. Yeah.
The custom elements method or the object is in the browser, right? So if the browser supports custom elements, it has that API, just like console.log, those kinds of things.
And so, all right, so outside of our Angular application, so here we've already done the stuff that I mentioned. So in the package JSON, so we ran build, we ran package, and it output this ng_elements.js. So out here, we have an index.html, which is super basic. So we're importing our script, so ng_elements, and then the file. And then we're going to use our ngBasic component. And so we're adding an event lister to that action that we set up. And so every time that action is fired, we're going to console log action is emitted and the event detail, which in this case is like a little string that says the click counter. And so let's pop over here. All right. So this is, so we just ran a basic HTTP server. And so this is just that index HTML that we were just looking at. And so we can click here. And so we see the title changes, the DOM's updating. Let me zoom in. The same as it was before. And then down here, we see that an action was emitted, click counter 1. So even though we're not inside an Angular application, we're able to piggyback off of those things. And so the browser is able to like catch on to those events. So we can see that it's working. So let's go ahead and try, what if we wanted to control the title of the element from inside the HTML file, not inside the web component. So we're going to do a set timeout, and then in 3 seconds, it says you can change the title from here too. So let's hop over, we'll refresh. There we go. So that's cool. So even from within your HTML file, if you want essentially other scripts to interact with your web component, they can do that too. And then we can also pass in, so if we wanted to start with a title here, we would just pass it in. I'll refresh. And now my button says, I like cats. And it's factual, which is even better. And so what about plugging it into like Vue or React? I'm not actually a Vue or React developer. So I downloaded the CLIs and I created a basic Vue app. So it's called Vue ngElements. And basically we just have like the typical static stuff that comes with it. So we have a hello world page and a basic app setup. And so to get the web component into Vue, so we have this public folder. So in our HTML, we're just going to bring in our script. And then inside main.js, we need to add our web component selector to the list of ignored elements. So we specified that here inside Vue's main.js. And then inside our component, we're going to use our ngBasic, and we're going to pass in the title inside Vue now. So let's see if that works. So here it is inside our simple Vue Hello World app. And we have, I'm an Angular element inside Vue now. And so here, if we click, we still get the change detection inside that Angular element. So our title is changing, it's alternating just as we expected. We don't have any listeners to that output, that event action that we're firing, but that's still firing as well. And so the same is true for React. So let's take a look at that guy. And so here, we'll hop into the index.html. And so just add the script. And then inside our app.js, we just can add the ng basic. So let's do it here below the header. And then we have our React running, already preloaded. And so it's there too. And so with just this one simple component that we wrote, we've seen it in three separate frameworks. You can use it in anywhere you want. It doesn't have to have a framework running, which is really cool. So that's basically kind of the power of Angular elements. And let's see.
Do the other two frameworks have something analogous? Look like the basic structure is custom element and event listeners. The other two probably.
So I know that React does. I saw that when I was like just researching Angular elements. I don't work with Vue enough to know if you can package it as a web component.
Are you talking like the CLI of making web components with those frameworks? Or
Yeah, could you
assuming them?
My question was more on, is Angular doing some special sauce that, or languages easily create?
No, the Vue CLI has custom element built to do that as well. And then all of them will be basically the same thing. So declaring them and registering them in Angular, ignoring them in Vue, just use them in React.
Yeah.
And you can publish it to like the web registry, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And so kind of like as we look to the future of Angular elements, the Ivy compiler is coming soon. So like right now, one of the bigger cons is that it's just kind of a fat file because it does have a lot of overhead. And so once the Ivy compiler is here, that file size will get a lot smaller. And
What is
so
that file size roughly?
So right now, I'm not minifying it. I'm not uglifying it. Like I'm not doing anything to make it smaller. And it's like 200 kilobytes. So it's huge, but I'm not doing anything to it. I think broken down, it'd probably be closer to 33.
Ivy is an Angular compiler.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Do you know?
Crunch the Angular.
Yeah. So
code.
it'll tree shake like all of your dependencies and like Angular itself, basically. So it'll kind of get it down to like the smallest possible. So at ngConf, they did a demo with it and got a file down to like 7 KB, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it was like ultra small hello world component, which is really cool.
Yeah, so like that file that's and that has all the polyfills in it too. So like if you were going to publish that to like web components, obviously you would have the polyfills bundled up in it. You would just have the web component itself. You would minify that. It would probably be around like 10K, like 50K, depending on what you're doing. And then if you're using a whole bunch in your application, you would just pull them in, have the polyfills once, right? And then use Webpack to bundle them all. So we have a question online. Have you used this approach anywhere in production?
No.
So,
So Angular elements only became non-experimental a couple weeks ago with the release of Angular 6. So no, but I am excited about it. I think I can think of business uses for us that are small and not super dangerous. Like I'd probably start there. And even like, I think that, because it was the first release of Angular elements, so it'll become more polished over time for sure.
yeah, and like here at Bullhorn, we have a third-party component library that we created because we have a lot of partners that integrate with our systems. And that component library sort of requires them to know and understand Angular to use that and to make their extensions look like they're part of our application. And in the future, we see that component library actually, like, it'd still be an Angular component library, but then we have a separate build process where we make web components out of every single one of our components, publish those out, so then our partners can be like, oh, I want to write an extension using Vue or React or just native JavaScript and use jQuery for whatever reason that they might want to use jQuery for nowadays. So that's the end goal, that we kind of see Angular elements. That way our component libraries still use Angular, use everything that we're used to with like lifecycle hooks and change section strategies, all of those, but then also just generate the web components out of it to kind of get that added boost. And then we just consume it as an Angular application, as an Angular library in our applications, because we write Angular for all of our stuff. But having those web components built, that makes us able to basically, like, if we want to create a new application in React or Vue, we just consume the web components version of of our library.
And then they mentioned at ngConf, they mentioned that they've been dogfooding this at Angular for a long time. So a lot of their, like inside their CMS, they've been using Angular elements. I'm not sure if, like, I think all the ones that have the tabbable code, so those are all Angular elements that are wrapped as a web component. So it's definitely being used in production. And then the marketing example that I mentioned before, where if you have a marketing team with a static site and they want, like, that's a real world thing that literally people ask me about constantly. And so that's one use that I think would be great, with being able to like hand over to maybe a less technical group of your company, like just a piece that they can plug and play. And like, it would be a lot easier from my perspective to explain to them, pass in these inputs and then like include this script and you're good, as opposed to being like, you need to set up an Angular application and rebuild your site. So that's definitely a use that I see for it. Any other questions from you guys?
Can you just flip back to the page where you actually created the custom elements?
Yeah. The module or the component? Sure.
Difference between, I'm not an Angular
Oh, sure.
What is a module versus a component?
So the component is where we're defining like the actual component itself, and the module is basically where we're exposing it. And so this is the component decorator. So we have the selector, the template, set up some simple styles, view encapsulation.
This could be consumed into an Angular app without any.
Yeah, out of the box you can consume that. Basically, like, here we're setting up the components, like what the view is, what your styles are, and all of your logic around, like, okay, when I click this button, it's going to do this logic. And then inside of the module, this is where Angular itself has its own module system. And then, like, you're basically saying, here are the components I've created. Basically, you're telling the Angular compiler, like, hey, when you see this selector, you're going to use this component. It has this view, this style, this logic. And then when you use that, Angular sees that in your HTML. It's going to compile that component, give you that component available. So that's why in the module there, we have to define the custom elements that we're going to use to basically tell Angular, like, hey, this is a web component we're going to be consuming inside of our library.
Can you use this with SQL Service or Firebase?
Yeah, so like in her component there, she had the HTTP object in there, so you can have Firebase, you can have your own services, all of that will communicate to a REST API, pull stuff in, that you can actually manipulate and do like flip posts and all of that. So think of it as like you had like a user profile widget or something where they can change their name or status. Like all of that can be contained.
And where would the code to connect to Firebase? What's that?
It would go inside of your
Just be in the
inside.
Yeah. There's a cool, so Angular Firebase does a cool quick start thing that is, it's linked in the slides, which we can send out later, but where they set up like a little, like an email list sign up where that like hooks into a Firebase. So it walks you through connecting to Firebase through the component and then shows you like the working email list component, which I think is like a super handy potential use of this, where you could like, that might be shared across teams or companies or whatever. But so that's linked at the end of the slides, so we can post that in the meetup group later. Yeah.
But Angular also consume like all the components, like any sort of like web service.
Yeah, so the same as like the way that we just had like Vue and React consume this web component, you could do the same in reverse. I know there's a company called Vaadin that does a lot of running Polymer inside Angular, so they have some good tutorials on that.
A good tip from online says, so like that custom elements that you're asking for, so when the browser sees a random tag, then it'll ask the custom elements for the JavaScript class and constructor method and instantiate that.
That's cool.
That's in all Angular browsers too.
Yeah. But there are polyfills for older browsers, but I wouldn't really dive too deep into like the web component world here. Still support like IE9.
Yeah.
You're probably gonna have a terrible run. Yeah. So put your JavaScript somewhere else. Well, you're only working from.
Do you know why automatic change detection is not working and you have to trigger that manually?
I don't. And I wouldn't think that that would be the ideal. And so that might be like a first release thing. But yeah, but you do have to trigger it manually. So at first I was like, this, like it's not working. Like I can't tell if it's like, and so, but yeah, so you had to manually call detect changes. And I found a couple other, like because it is relatively new, there aren't a ton of other sites that you can see like doing anything beyond a toy application. And so, yeah, so currently you got to run detect changes.
Do you know if that would work if you consume that web components within an Angular application?
That'd be interesting. I would think it would because it's still all encapsulated, but I would think it would work the same way as consuming any web component inside another framework because it's all encapsulated. And so it would be like essentially a duplication of all that overhead of Angular, right? But beyond that, it should work.
Every time you update the DOM from component, content changes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, I would assume if your web component has Angular subcomponents that you can do whatever change detection you want within those, but it's just at the main level that is the web component that the outside world has to deal with.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense.
Any property that you change is going to be reflected in your view. That's when you trigger change detection. Basically, like if you take all the best practices of making like really high performing Angular components where you're going to do change detection on push anyway, and then that's when you usually do like detect changes or mark for check. You do the same concepts here in Angular element land.
So for example, like, so here in this change title, if we had commented out detect changes, on click, like change title would still get called and the action would still be emitted. So if you were listening to it, you would still see that console output in the browser, but the title from the view perspective, it would not update.
So if you have child components which are manipulating DOM, you should also do detect changes on the child.
Yeah, if you're anything you do to manipulate the DOM, yeah. Anybody else? I know I'd give a fast talk, so you might have some time back tonight.
So as a non-Angular person, are there any truly killer Angular components that you've seen in Angular but not other places that I should consider doing this?
I think the most useful, like the email sign up has been the most useful one that I've seen so far that I can picture being super applicable. Otherwise, I think it depends a lot on your business and your use cases. Like whatever problems, like if there are problems you can solve, like if you have teams using different frameworks and you have to share code or rewrite something, this would be a great application. Or if you're working with a different department who's less technical, who you have to interface with, and there are ways that you can make that easier, I think that would also be a great application for this.
And the end goal, right? You would either publish them somewhere privately where you can share them across your company, or publish them to like the web component registry. So there, it doesn't, like the web component registry doesn't care if you created it with the Vue CLI, the Angular CLI, created it with React or whatever, because it compiles down to like native web component logic and code. So on that registry, you can search for thousands of like, if you need to login page or this or that. So like there's a whole bunch of components out there that are either written with Polymer, written with native web components that are published.
Like I can think of 4 people at my current company, which isn't that big, who have written a date picker for us. And so if we could just web component a date picker, that would solve some problems.
Any other questions or anything?
How big can be to migrate from the Angular JS to the Angular 6?
Oof. It's not easy. How big of an application is it?
It's just 5 pages. It is a small application.
Okay.
Totally, it's better to scrap everything or
I would think so, yeah. I'd probably just rebuild it.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I typically hear from people.
If you want to scrap everything,
Right, yeah. I know there is like the upgrade path, but I haven't heard of many people who've done it successfully. I feel like a lot of people have just said, just write it out. Like if it's small enough too, maybe you could rewrite it as web components. That way you can plug them into your old Angular application and get value. Like that way business will see that you're providing value the whole time. Full circle.
Cool technology. I feel like it's me one step closer to not having a job.
No. I think it's
Someone
real
has to write all
cool.
the web.
Yeah.
As long as they're not up on the registry yet.
So, my wheels started. What can you pass in? Pass in an observer. It's like
Basically,
go nuts with communication.
same stuff that you would pass in with an Angular, like an Angular input. Like you would never use an observable as like an Angular input.
Sure.
So basically, your inputs are going to be like JSON objects.
Okay.
But
I'm wondering what can jump the wire.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine.
If you're using a subject inside the web component, can you subscribe to it outside of it?
I think you'd have to communicate via event emitters. I think that's your only output.
you were able to do the .title. So if it was a public,
That's maybe.
I don't know.
So
It'd be
maybe.
interesting.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah, and all the slides and everything will be posted on the meetup. So it's good. I'm gonna kill the Hangouts and then we're just gonna talk about some general meetup stuff.